Flashman on the March by George MacDonald Fraser. Book review. So this is the 12th and final book in the Flashman series. It was published in 2005, the last Flashman book to be published before George MacDonald Fraser died. It's not the final book in terms of the internal chronology of the Flashman series. There are books that were published earlier in the series that take place later in time than this book. But as I've mentioned before on this channel, after book 5, the books are all out of order in terms of the sequence of Flashman's life. If you're not familiar with the Flashman series, I don't want to get into all the background information here. I have other videos in which I talk about what the Flashman series is and what you can expect from that genre. And I will link to those videos in the description down below. For now, all I'm going to say is it's a series of historical fiction about the British Empire. More information, look at the videos down below. So this book deals with the 1867 British invasion of Abyssinia, what is today known as Ethiopia, but what was known as Abyssinia in the 19th century. Here is the historical background which makes up the factual basis of this historical novel. In 1867, the mad emperor of Abyssinia, Theodore, has taken several British citizens as hostages, and the British government sends in an army to rescue them. The campaign is a logistical nightmare. The British are marching into unfamiliar territory in the middle of a mountainous desert terrain where they must forage for food and water. They have to use elephants to bring their artillery up the mountains. Many observers at the time didn't think they would come back. All of this is very well portrayed in detail in the novel. In this novel as well, the Land of Abyssinia is also described in some detail. And author George MacDonald Fraser brings out all of the wonder of the place. I never really considered this before, or knew much of this before, but Abyssinia is unique at the time because it was a Christian land that had not been conquered by the invading Muslim empire. So it's kind of a Christian island in the Muslim empire of North Africa. And then later on in the 19th century, Abyssinia or Ethiopia would also be unique because it was the only African country not to be colonized by Europe. So I guess it's doubly unique in that regard. But in 1867, when this story takes place, it's before the scramble for Africa. So at this time, it's unique because it's a Christian land in the middle of the Muslim empire. And it's thought to be the inspiration for Prester John. If you're not familiar with Prester John was a mythical Christian king, a medieval legend that people believed in during the Crusades, who supposedly had a Christian kingdom that reigned on the other side of the Muslim empire. Some people think that Abyssinia or Ethiopia was the origin of the Prester John myth. So that all of that was fascinating, and all of that was in the novel or in the footnotes to the novel. Now, in the 19th century, when this novel takes place, Ethiopia is still a Christian country, although it has retained an unorthodox form of Christianity, which apparently is possibly an older form of Christianity than the Christianity which went on to dominate Europe. The Christian emperor of Abyssinia is a guy named Theodore, and he has visions of driving the Muslims out of Jerusalem. And in fact, one of the reasons he became so hostile to the British and captured their citizens is because he thought he was being snubbed by Queen Victoria, who he viewed as his fellow equal Christian monarch. All of these fascinating details come through in the novel. And once again, Flashman finds himself in the middle of it. Now, if you've read the Flashman books, you know that Flashman is always a reluctant participant. And that's true in this book as well. A series of events, starting out with Flashman as the aide-de-camp to the doomed Emperor Maximilian of Mexico, ends up with Flashman joining the British campaign to Abyssinia, despite his every attempt to weasel out of it. As always, Flashman ends up encountering numerous real-life historical figures. And as always, much of what Flashman sees and hears is backed up by historical footnotes from George MacDonald Fraser. For instance, in one of these footnotes, Fraser indicates that much of what Flashman hears Emperor Theodore say in the novel actually comes verbatim from other sources. So I thought that was really interesting. Other than that, there's not a lot for me to add in this review that I haven't said in any of my reviews of the previous Flashman books. And by the time the reader gets to book 12 in the series, no doubt they know what to expect. And they won't be disappointed. There are plenty of colorful descriptions of exotic lands and historical figures, and Flashman has his usual series of narrow escapes from all kinds of dangers. It's an excellent read, even if I'm not sure I agree with the politics of the book. Which brings me to my next point, the politics of the book. The early Flashman books highlighted the more shameful or bungling episodes of the British Empire. The invasions of Afghanistan, the charge of the Light Brigade, the Sepoy Rebellion, etc. In these books, Flashman's cowardliness served as a satire on the cult of Victorian heroism. The irony was that Flashman's shameless sense of self-preservation made him less of a danger to society than all the honorable Victorian soldiers, whose heads were filled with notions of glory for Queen and Empire, and who were likely to lead men into massacres or conduct one themselves. However, starting with Book 6, Flashman's Lady, a tonal shift seemed to be evident in these books. Instead of serving as a satire on Victorian heroism, Flashman became a foil for it. The stories focused on British soldiers and generals whose heroism author George MacDonald Fraser seemed to admire, and the fictional Flashman's own cruelty and cowardliness now served as a contrast to emphasize the honor of the British officer. I'm not entirely sure what caused this tonal shift, but I was much more comfortable with the politics of the earlier books than with the pro-imperial themes of the later books. This book in particular follows that same pattern, where the British expedition is portrayed in a very positive light, and Lord Napier, who led the expedition, is repeatedly praised throughout the book. Now, granted, this is one episode of Imperial British history where the British did seem to be in the right. They were defending their own citizens, they were provoked, they were putting down a ruthless African tyrant. But then, part of the interpretation of history is knowing which events to selectively emphasize. Fraser could have chosen to write about many other historical incidents in which the British Army was not in the right. For example, at the same time that the Abyssinian expedition was happening, the Maori Wars were happening in New Zealand, where the Maori essentially had their land stolen from them by the British settlers. Also, the invasion of Abyssinia may have had political as well as humanitarian motivations. Now, I'm not an expert. I'm just an amateur history buff. But I've looked at this, I've seen this incident portrayed in two other histories. One is the BBC radio show, This Sceptred Isle, the Empire spin-off part of it, which I've talked about on this channel before. And the other is the book, The Decline and Fall of the British Empire by Piers Brandon, which I've not talked about on this channel yet, but I will be talking about it someday soon. Anyways, both of these sources emphasize that the British Army was sent not purely to rescue the hostages, but also to bolster British prestige worldwide at a time when there was growing concern that the British Empire might soon be eclipsed by their European rivals. Also, it was necessary that British prestige be upheld in Africa in order to discourage revolts in India. This perspective is largely absent from the book Flashman on the March, or at least not emphasized. Flashman does briefly acknowledge the wider political implications of the venture. In my copy, this occurred on page 26, and because it occurs in Flashman's own voice, his own narrator's voice, it's irreverent, racist, and politically incorrect language that I don't dare quote here. So I won't. You can reference the book if you want to see what I'm talking about. But this wider context, once acknowledged, is then forgotten in favor of rhetoric about soldiers always doing what is right and a government's sacred duty to protect its citizens. George MacDonald Fraser even doubles down on this point in his author's introduction to the book, where he writes, quoting from the author's introduction on page 10, "And it may be that along with the light he, Flashman, casts on a unique chapter of imperial history, he invites a comparison with a later and less glorious day. For Flashman's story is about a British army sent out in a good and honest cause by a government who knew what honor meant. It was not sent without initial follies and hesitations in high places, or until every hope of a peaceful issue was gone. It went with the fear of disaster hanging over it, but the British public in no doubt that it was right. It served no politician's vanity or interest. It went without messianic rhetoric. There are no false excuses, no deceits, no cover-ups or lies, just a decent resolve to do a government's first duty, to protect its people, whatever the cost. To quote Flashman again, those were the days." Well, that seems to be laying it on a bit thick, doesn't it? Was the British government really that honorable in the 1867 Abyssinia intervention? Maybe not, but maybe I'm being a little bit too harsh on George MacDonald Fraser, because this book, it's worth remembering, was published in 2005 when the Iraq War was in full swing. And keeping that in mind, it's easy to see that the later and less glorious day he mentions is no doubt Britain's participation in the Iraq War. In fact, if you go through and reread that paragraph I just quoted earlier, it looks like Fraser is saying that it looks like all the things that Fraser is saying that the Abyssinian campaign is not, he's therefore implying that the Iraq War was. In other words, he's saying in the Iraq War there were false excuses, there were deceits, there were cover-ups, and there were lies. To which I can only add, yeah, I agree completely with that. Okay, last little section on the end. I'm going to talk briefly about the connection between this book and some of the other books I've been reading lately and have been reviewing on this channel. This is admittedly probably only of interest to me, so feel free to stop the video here if you're not interested. But connections to other books I've been reading lately. The Abyssinian incident takes place 10 years before the scramble for Africa, but it's sometimes described as a prelude to the scramble for Africa. and some of the dramatis personae are the same. For example, Sir Henry Morton Stanley, who played such a big part in Stanley Pakenham's book, The Scramble for Africa, which I reviewed on this channel. Sir Henry Morton Stanley was one of the newspaper correspondents assigned to the Abyssinian campaign, and he pops up a few times in Flashman on the March. Another newspaper writer who is briefly featured as a character in this book is G.A. Henty, who later went on to cover the Sudan Wars in the 1890s, and is featured in Three Empires on the Nile by Dominic Green, which I've also reviewed on this channel. The British campaign to end slavery in the Suez is one of the major themes in Dominic Green's book, and it also briefly features in Flashman on the March, when Flashman finds himself on the boat of an overly zealous anti-slavery British naval officer. And lastly, Richard Burton. I've reviewed a biography of Richard Burton on this channel, and Richard Burton's quarrels with his fellow explorer John Speke about who discovered what on the Nile River are also mentioned briefly in this book. And that's all I've got. So, yes, highly recommend this book. Of course, by the time you work your way up to book 12 of the Flashman series, you don't need me to recommend it to you. You've already either decided by this point that you like the series or you don't like it. But for what it's worth, I recommend this book.